I asked my stepson to fix my bra strap, and his pants slipped down. Sorry, Ro. The mansion seemed bigger than life itself on one of those afternoons. The hardwood flooring in the living room was streaked with golden light as the sun shone through the windows. As I folded laundry on the couch, my fingers working instinctively, the only sound to accompany me was the soft hum of the air conditioner. I hardly had to think about it because the task's rhythm was so embedded. However, my mind was far from still. I couldn't recall the last time Stephen, my husband, had given me a genuine kiss. Not just a quick peck on the cheek or a hasty farewell on his way to work. The sort that left you gasping for air and craving more, and that made your heart skip a beat. Though years had passed, the pain of its absence remained as raw as ever. My husband had become a strange person within our own home, buried in endless meetings, emails, and the constant glow of his phone. His presence was physical, yet it felt hauntingly absent. I caught a glimpse of myself in the window, the late afternoon sunlight casting a soft glow on the faint lines beginning to etch themselves around my eyes. At 36, I wasn't old, but neither was I the carefree girl I once saw in the mirror. My hand instinctively brushed the strap of my camisole, the lace catching faintly against my skin. The way the cloth held onto me was both reassuring and playful. I paused to wonder, when had someone last truly paid attention to me? Then my stepson, Anthony, appeared. Since graduating from university and returning to save money while looking for a job, he has been living with us for a few months. At the age of 23, he was a reflection of what Stephen used to be, spirited, dynamic, and effortlessly self-assured. At first, he had served as a reminder of the distance between my husband and me. Recently, however, it has taken on a whole other form. I observed how his eyes brightened as he spoke about his future aspirations and how his laughter filled the house. I also saw how his white t-shirt stuck to his chest and how his perfume hung in the air after he walked through. Even though I attempted to ignore the notion, I knew it was wrong to think of him this way, but emotions don't always follow the rules. The sound of footsteps interrupted my thoughts. The woman who'd moved to the front of my bedside to read Simon's mind. Anthony, my stepson, was searching through the refrigerator in the kitchen. His bare feet shuffled softly on the tile, and I could hear glass bottles clinking. The air became thicker, and the place felt warmer, as if his presence alone could change the atmosphere. "Anthony," I called out, my voice calm and unwavering, hiding the storm of emotions churning within me. A moment later, he appeared in the doorway, his tall silhouette illuminated by the kitchen light. He wore a plain t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair slightly messy, as if he'd just woken up. "Can you help me with something?" "Of course," he replied easily, stepping into the room. His relaxed confidence only heightened the magnetic pull I felt toward him. Turning away from him, I fumbled with the clasp of my bra beneath my camisole. "The strap keeps slipping," I murmured, my voice softening to almost a whisper. There was a brief pause, a moment of hesitation that lingered like the final note of a melody. Then I heard him move closer. My breath hitched as his hands brushed my shoulders, his fingers lightly grazing the delicate strap as he adjusted it. His touch was steady yet gentle, purposeful in a way that sent a shiver down my spine. "Is this all right?" he asked, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "Yes," I answered, my voice barely audible. The room felt impossibly small, the distance between us closing with every passing moment. His fingers lingered just a bit longer than necessary, and I felt the warmth of his breath on the back of my neck. It was intoxicating, how something so simple could spark a fire that had been quietly smoldering inside me for so long. When he stepped back, I turned to encounter him, my hands automatically adjusting the strap again, even though it was already in place. Our eyes met, and for the first time, I saw something in his look that mirrored my own feelings. A silent tension, an unasked question neither of us dared to speak. "Thanks," I said, breaking the silence, though my voice lacked the usual ease I would have utilized in any other case. "You're welcome," he responded, his tone equally soft. But he didn't move. He remained still, his gaze briefly drifting to the neckline of my camisole, before meeting my gaze again. The moment dragged on, full of the things neither of us dared to utter because we were too scared or careless. Then his phone buzzed in his pocket, as if the world itself was trying to break the spell. We were both startled back to reality by the sound, and he hurriedly grabbed it while saying something about having to answer a call. As he walked out of the room, I remained standing there long after he was gone, my heart racing in my chest. My mind replayed every moment of what had just occurred. It was innocent. It had to be. However, the way my skin tingled where his touch lingered, the way my body seemed to buzz with unfamiliar energy, told me it was anything but. Later that night, as I lay in bed alone, the memory of his touch came flooding back. I shut my eyes, willing the thoughts to disappear, but they clung stubbornly. Deep within, beneath layers of guilt and uncertainty, a question began to surface, a question that could change everything. If something so small could feel this intense, what would occur if we stopped pretending it didn't exist? Although the home had always been peaceful, it suddenly seemed to be teeming with possibilities, with every instant bearing the weight of potential outcomes. That afternoon, the home was unusually quiet, the type of silence that magnifies every distant hum of the refrigerator and every squeak of the floorboards. I was standing in front of the mirror in the bedroom, attempting to adjust the strap of my beloved blue bra, saving. Similar to so many other things in my life, it had always been erratic, sliding just enough to let me know it wasn't flawless. However, the strap seemed more stubborn than ever today. I tugged at it, contorting my arm awkwardly behind me, but the clasp refused to give. My reflection stared back at me, a silent dare glinting in my eyes. Ask for help. It wasn't something I did regularly. Stephen wasn't around. He hardly ever was these days. Seeking help had become a nearly forgotten instinct. But today felt different. The loneliness weighed heavier, like an endless shadow swallowing every trace of light. Then I heard Anthony's footsteps in the hallway, the familiar shuffle of his sneakers brushing against the carpet. Without thinking, I simply called his name. "Anthony." A pause. His footsteps ceased and then approached. "Yes," he said in a casual, indifferent tone, but there was a warmth to it that I hadn't previously detected. I turned to the doorway and said, "I need a favor," as he emerged. His wide shoulders filled the room as he leaned against the frame, one hand resting on the edge. I knew it wasn't intentional, yet his t-shirt held him in a way that felt purposeful. Anthony was just himself, relaxed, self-assured, and effortlessly present. 5 stars. "Hey, what's going on?" he asked, his brow knitting slightly as his gaze locked onto mine. I paused briefly, the words catching in my throat, but I forced myself to keep it light and casual. "This strap," I said, motioning to my shoulder. "It's driving me nuts. Can you help me fix it?" The request lingered between us, like an invisible thread drawing us closer. His expression shifted subtly, his eyebrows rising in mild surprise before settling into something more unreadable. Yeah, sure," he replied, stepping into the room. I turned my back to him, suddenly acutely aware of everything. The way the afternoon light traced the curve of my neck, the faint hint of his cologne as he moved closer, the sound of his breathing steady, but slightly heavier than before. As his fingertips touched my shoulder, My skin tingled. His fingers were hesitant at first, but as he manipulated the clasp, they became more confident. "Is this all right?" he said, his voice now barely audible. I responded yes in a scarcely audible voice. Something I couldn't identify but couldn't ignore made the air around us seem heavy. His fingers were warm, his touch both gentle and assured, as if he were carefully navigating something delicate. I closed my eyes briefly, allowing the feeling to envelop me. Such a simple touch, yet it felt like a lifeline. "There," he said after a pause, stepping back slightly. "That should be good now." I turned to face him, my hand instinctively moving to adjust the strap again, though it was fine as it was. Our eyes locked, and for a fleeting moment everything else disappeared. The room, the light, the faint hum of the house. All that remained was the intensity of his gaze, a look that seemed to pierce through me, past the carefully constructed barriers I had so carefully built around myself. "Thank you," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "No problem," he responded but didn't move. He stood there, hands by his sides, his eyes briefly drifting to the strap, before meeting mine once more. The moment lingered, thick with tension, until his phone buzzed in his pocket, shattering the silence. He fumbled to retrieve it, apologizing softly as he checked the screen. "I'll take this," he said, stepping back toward the door. Even as he left, his eyes stayed on me for just a moment, as if he didn't want to walk away. Once he was gone, the room felt emptier than previously, and the silence appeared louder. I sat on the edge of the bed, my fingers lightly grazing the strap of my bra, now perfectly adjusted. However, I wasn't considering the strap. It was the sensation of his hands on my skin, and the way his eyes saw me as a woman, not simply his stepmother. The notion persisted, unwanted yet unavoidable. It wasn't just about Anthony. It was about me, about the part of me that had been deprived of attention, of touch, of the kind of closeness that makes you feel truly alive. And I felt noticed for the first time in years. I relived the scene in my head as I lay in bed that night, remembering every detail as if it were occurring again. The way his fingers had paused before gaining confidence, the softness in his voice when he asked if it was okay, the way his gaze lingered, filled with something I couldn't quite define but didn't want to ignore. I knew I ought to feel guilty, that I should shove the thoughts aside, bury them somewhere unreachable, but I didn't. Instead, I allowed them to linger, to swirl and expand, nurturing a part of me that had been ignored for far too long. When I closed my eyes, I couldn't stop myself from wondering, if something so simple could stir such feelings within me, what else might be lying just beneath the surface, waiting to unravel everything? It was a question I wasn't ready to face, yet I couldn't help but anticipate the answer. The days that followed felt endlessly drawn out, as though time itself had slowed, forcing me to confront the thoughts I wasn't even ready to acknowledge to myself. I attempted to keep myself occupied with chores, losing myself in the familiar rhythm of folding laundry, wiping down countertops, and watering the plants on the back porch. Yet, no matter how hard I worked to distract myself, the memory of Anthony's touch lingered, subtle but inescapable, like the faint trace of perfume. Every corner of the house seemed to whisper reminders of him, the faint scent of his cologne in the hallway, the echo of his laughter from the living room, the way his coffee mug always ended up in the sink despite my repeated requests to put it in the dishwasher. Each small detail felt amplified, magnified by the tension that now hung between us like an unspoken truth. It was late afternoon when I saw him again. Sunlight poured through the living room windows, painting golden streaks across the floor as I sat curled up on the couch, a book open in my lap. But I wasn't really reading. My eyes skimmed the words, though my mind was far away. I could hear him moving around in the kitchen, the sound of glasses clinking, and the faint murmur of a podcast he wasn't fully paying attention to. "Hey," he said, appearing in the doorway with a glass of iced tea in his hand. He paused for a moment before stepping into the room, his presence immediately filling the space, making the air feel thick and heavy. "You look comfortable," he remarked, a small smile tugging at his lips. I looked down at myself, bare feet tucked beneath me, an oversized sweater hanging loosely on my shoulders. Comfortable wasn't exactly the word I would have used. Vulnerable, perhaps. Exposed, in a way that went beyond what I was wearing. "It's a perfect day for being lazy," I answered, attempting to sound casual, though my heart was racing. He produced a warm, low laugh that stirred something deep within me. He motioned to the opposite end of the couch and said, "Mind if I sit?" "Of course not," I replied, but my voice sounded too eager and too fast. As he settled in, I moved a little to give him space. Take a tidy breath," I said softly, worried that Franklin might hear. "Let me get you what you're needing," he said. His weight made the cushions sink. As he settled in, he extended his long legs and brushed them against mine. The touch was fleeting and unintentional, yet it sent a shiver up my spine that I hoped he didn't notice. For a moment we sat in silence, the only noise the occasional rustle of pages as I pretended to read. But the tension between us was undeniable, an invisible thread pulling tighter with each passing second. I could feel his gaze on me, not steady but lingering, like he was trying to figure something out without quite asking. "Sarah," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was softer now, almost unsure. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes," I responded, though the word caught in my throat. He paused, running a hand through his hair in a way that seemed almost uncertain. "The other day, when I helped you with your strap, did that, was that awkward for you?" His question lingered, heavy with unspoken meaning. I felt my cheeks warm, a flush creeping up as I searched for the right response. "No," I said at last, though my voice was softer than I intended. "It wasn't awkward, just surprising." "Yeah," he murmured, his gaze locking with mine. "Surprising," he echoed, the word hanging between us as though he were trying to unravel its significance, to see where it belonged in the space that had formed between us. We stayed silent for what felt like an eternity. The room was unnervingly still, and the space between us seemed both enormous and non-existent. Then, almost as if compelled by an invisible pull, he moved closer, his knee grazing mine once more, this time intentionally. He whispered "Sarah" in a voice that was now hardly audible. For the first time I noticed something in his eyes that I couldn't ignore, a vulnerability and a need that reflected mine, and intended to reply, but nothing came out. Rather, I took from the book resting on my lap, slowly closing it before placing it to the side. My hand hesitated for a moment, hovering over the cushion between us, before settling there, close enough to feel the warmth of his leg brushing against my fingers. I noticed his breath hitch slightly, and it struck me just how near we were, how the smallest gesture could close the space between us entirely. My heart was pounding so fiercely I was convinced he could hear it, yet he didn't pull away. If anything, he leaned closer, his gaze locked firmly on mine. The moments stretched endlessly, as though time itself had paused, the world holding its breath. I could feel the heat emanating from him, the charged energy in the air between us, and I knew this connection, whatever it was something far beyond our control. "Anthony," I murmured, my voice shaky, but strong enough to pierce the silence. Before I could say another word, the front door creaked open, breaking the spell. Stephen's cheerful voice rang out from the hallway. "I'm home." Anthony recoiled so abruptly, it was as if he'd been burned. his expression instantly transforming into one of calm, practiced indifference. I picked up the book from the cushion, flipping it open and pretending to read, though the words on the page blurred together. Stephen entered the room moments later, his grin wide and carefree. "I'm going to let you go now." "Hey, you two," he greeted, setting his briefcase down by the door. "What's going on?" "But not much," I replied, forcing a smile as I looked up at him. "Just unwinding," Eddie said. Anthony stayed silent, but the tension coming off him was palpable. His hands fidgeted against his thighs, as if trying to steady himself. Stephen didn't seem to notice. He planted a distracted kiss on my forehead before heading into the kitchen, leaving the two of us alone once more. Neither of us moved for a long moment, the weight of what had nearly transpired bearing down on us. After that, silently, Anthony got up and walked out of the room, his steps purposeful and swift. I remained where I was, trying to control my breathing while keeping my fingers firmly grasping the book. My thoughts were racing, and I could still feel his touch and eyes on my skin. Regardless of what this was or signified, I was confident that it wasn't even close to being over. What had begun as a peaceful moment had evolved into something far more intricate, and the prospect of what may happen next was both exciting and disturbing. That night, the storm was inside of me, not outside. The house was enveloped in an unusual stillness, the kind that signals an impending shift. The power had cut out without warning, leaving the rooms illuminated by the unsteady glow of candlelight. Shadows flickered on the walls, moving like silent witnesses to my inner turmoil, their forms shifting with every faint breeze. The storm within me had been brewing for days, maybe even weeks, and tonight it felt closer to breaking than ever before. I sat cross-legged on the living room floor, a deck of cards spread out in front of me. Playing solitaire by candlelight seemed like a desperate attempt to occupy my hands and distract my mind, but it was failing. My thoughts kept wandering to the moment Anthony's hand had brushed against mine earlier that day, a fleeting touch that left a lingering warmth in its wake. He was in the kitchen, searching through the fridge for a drink, his shadow extending down the hallway. When he came back, his figure appeared first, broad shoulders illuminated by the gentle light of the candles. He was holding 2 glasses of lemonade, with condensation forming on the outside in the humid air. He silently handed me one, then lowered himself to the floor with a calmness that contrasted with the strain building between us. "Thanks," I murmured, my voice softer than I meant. I avoided looking at him, instead focusing on the flickering candle next to me, but I could sense his gaze on me, his presence as palpable as the humid air sticking to my skin. "No problem," he responded, his tone just as quiet. He leaned back on his hands and stretched his legs out in front of him. The movement was casual and effortless, but my eyes betrayed me, catching the way his t-shirt shifted slightly, exposing a small strip of tanned, taut skin just above his waistband. I forced myself to look away, but the image was already burned into my memory. "Power outages always feel so odd," I said, my voice cutting through the silence, like the world pauses for a moment. "Yeah," he replied, his eyes still locked on me. "Everything feels different when it's this quiet." His words lingered between us, heavy with unspoken implications. I shuffled the deck of cards absent-mindedly, the soft rustle of the thin cards breaking the stillness. Anthony reached out, drew a card from the stack, and placed it down with careful precision. "Solitaire?" he asked, a small smile pulling at the edges of his lips. "Just want to pass the time," I answered, offering a shy smile in return. He leaned in a bit, close enough that I could feel his warmth. His scent, fresh, with a trace of wood, surrounded me, and I had to resist the urge to close my eyes and let it consume me. The air between us seemed to grow denser, the flickering candlelight casting shadows that felt almost secretive. "Do you ever feel like—" Anthony started, his voice fading as he nervously toyed with the corner of the playing card. "Like things aren't meant to stay the same forever?" His question took me by surprise, its simplicity masking the depth of what he truly meant. For the first time that evening, I met his eyes, my heartbeat pounding in my chest. His gaze was steady, probing mine for an answer I wasn't certain I could provide. "And you, I think change is unavoidable," I murmured at last, my voice soft, "even when we're not prepared for it." His eyes remained fixed on mine as he nodded slowly. "Yes, it is logical." The distance between us felt impossibly narrow now, infused with an energy I couldn't describe but couldn't ignore. His hand slid almost imperceptibly closer to mine, and my heartbeat increased. It was a little move that might have been written off as an accident, but it was clear what the goal was. "Sarah," he continued quietly, his voice bearing the weight of all that we had not yet talked. Sarah sighed. I was unable to answer, so I didn't. My thoughts were a jumbled mass of need and anxiety, and my throat felt constricted. As if guided by an unseen force, his fingers grazed mine, a hesitant touch that sparked a surge of energy through me. I froze, my breath hitching, yet I didn't pull back. The candlelight danced erratically, their flames swaying and writhing, as if caught in the same tempest swirling within me. Anthony's hand lingered, his touch gentle yet intentional, his eyes locked on mine, seeking either approval or perhaps forgiveness. I couldn't tear my gaze away, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but remain still, letting the moment envelop me entirely. "It's okay," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper, "if you're not ready." However, I desired in a frightening way, one that made my heart beat and my skin quiver. I was at a loss for words to describe the whirlpool of emotions that was roiling inside of me, so I did the only thing that came to mind. I silently responded to the question he hadn't asked by reaching for him and wrapping my fingers over his. The moment seemed to stretch infinitely, the air thick with anticipation. Then, just as the tension peaked, a distant thunderclap reverberated through the house, a stark reminder that the real storm raged on outside. Anthony leaned back slightly, his expression softening into one of quiet understanding. "We should check the candles," he said, his voice steadier now, though his eyes still revealed the inner conflict swirling within him. "Yeah," I replied, my own voice trembling but determined. "We should." As he rose to gather the candles, I stayed seated on the floor, my fingers still tingling from the memory of his touch. I was aware that this situation was far from ending, regardless of what it signified. Even though the storm was over for the time being, its effects were still being felt. Although it had been a calm night, the reverberations of what had happened were everything but. Between us, something had changed that was irreversible, and I knew in my heart that the true storm was yet to come. The house was cloaked in darkness, save for the dim glow of the television, casting shifting shadows on the walls. The movie continued playing, its dialogue fading into the background, though I couldn't remember its name or storyline. None of that mattered. The important thing was that Anthony and I were alone, sitting at opposite ends of the couch, separated by a single cushion that felt simultaneously too close and too distant. My untouched glass of wine rested on the coffee table, a delicate ring of condensation forming at its base. I was acutely aware of his presence, the silent pull between us growing stronger with each passing day. "Stephen, my husband went out of town again. My life was never the same without him, and today it was more painful than ever." Since supper, Anthony had been remarkably silent. His typical laid-back manner gave way to the same level of attention that I did. I glanced at him, following the contours of his profile, the angularness of his jaw, and the way his lips curled in the flickering light. He appeared lost in contemplation, yet unfocused, as though he were someplace else completely. "I can switch the movie if you're not enjoying it," I offered, breaking the silence. My voice sounded calmer than I actually felt. He turned to face me, his expression softening slightly. "No, it's okay. I'm just distracted." "By what?" I asked, even though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. His eyes lingered on mine a moment too long, making my breath hitch. There it was again, that unspoken tension, the invisible pull between us that I couldn't fully explain, but couldn't ignore. He hesitated, as if carefully choosing his words, before finally saying, "Nothing important." But his gaze betrayed him. I leaned back against the couch, my fingers clutching the edge of the blanket draped over my lap. The room felt uncomfortably warm, the air heavy with an indescribable tension. My heart quickened, and I hated how clear it was, as though he could hear it, feel it, even from across the room. I wanted to speak, to say something to break the silence, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, Anthony leaned in, just a little, his movement so subtle I almost didn't notice. My pulse raced as the gap between us closed, the atmosphere charged with an electric tension. I could feel his gaze on me, studying me, and for the first time in years, I felt like he truly saw me. As a woman, not as a wife or a stepmother. "Sarah," he whispered, my name sending a chill down my spine. My heart pounding, I turned to face him. His eyes searched mine for something I couldn't identify, and his demeanor was inscrutable. As the movie went on, the noises faded into the background and were replaced by the thundering thud of my heartbeat and the constant rhythm of my breathing. "What is it?" My question was hardly audible above a whisper. I don't want to make you feel uncomfortable," he said, his words careful, deliberate. "But I can't stop thinking about—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the meaning was clear, unspoken yet understood. The tension in the air between us was palpable, heavy with what he had said and what he had left unsaid. My thoughts spun in a blur, emotions tangled together in a way I couldn't make sense of. I knew I should stop this, whatever it was, before it went any further. But I couldn't bring myself to move, to speak, or to do anything except sit there, waiting for what would unfold next. "Anthony," I started, my voice unsteady. "This isn't right. We can't—" "I know," he interrupted quickly. "I know we can't, but that doesn't change how I feel." His admission washed over me, overwhelming and consuming, leaving me breathless. I felt stripped bare and vulnerable, yet a part of me longed to surrender to it, to lose myself in the overwhelming depth of it all. I closed my eyes. His eyes locked onto mine, and I saw the same battle waging within him: fear, longing, guilt, and something that felt painfully close to hope. Before I could respond, he reached for my hand. His touch was gentle, but intentional. My breath caught as his fingers grazed mine, the heat of his skin sparking a surge of electricity through me. I should have stepped away, but I didn't. Instead, I let him take my hand, his grip firm yet tender, as if he feared I might vanish. "I don't want to hurt you," he murmured, his voice barely audible, "but I can't act like this isn't real." His words lingered between us, weighty and inescapable. My mind screamed for me to end this, to pull back, to say something that would break the spell, but my body betrayed me, leaning into his touch, yearning for the connection I'd been missing for so long. The space between us dissolved as he moved closer, his face mere inches from mine. I could feel his breath on my skin, warm and steady, and his scent, clean, masculine, utterly intoxicating, overwhelmed my senses. My heart pounded so fiercely I was certain he could hear it, but he didn't retreat. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his gaze fixed on mine, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. "Anthony," I whispered, my voice shaky but strong enough to hold his focus. He didn't answer aloud, but his eyes spoke volume. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that began tentative, almost unsure, as though waiting for me to stop him. But I didn't. Rather, I closed my eyes, surrendering to the moment, to the warmth of his touch, to the way his hand cradled my face so tenderly it made my heart ache. The kiss deepened, becoming more daring and more certain, and I felt something inside me shatter. A barrier that had held back years of yearning, frustration, and loneliness. My hands instinctively gripped his shoulders, holding on tightly as if he were the only thing anchoring me. The world around us dissolved into nothingness, leaving just the two of us and the charged energy sparking between us. But afterward, as suddenly as it started, it was over. Anthony pulled away, his breathing unsteady, his eyes searching mine with a mix of fear and longing. "We can't," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't want to hurt you, or him." I nodded, my own breath trembling. "I know," I replied, though the words felt empty. The weight of what had just happened bore down on me, and I realized there was no turning back. The line had been crossed, and the consequences loomed just ahead. The ensuing stillness, which contained all we were unable to express, was deafening. My heart continued to race as I sat there, wondering what would happen next and whether we would make it through. The bright golden morning light that came through the curtains did nothing to quiet the fury that was raging inside of me. I sat on the edge of my bed, the silence of the home weighing me down like a burden. My thoughts replayed the previous night's events non-stop, each time more vivid than the one before. The warmth of Anthony's touch, the taste of his kiss, the way he had pulled away with regret etched in his eyes, mingled with something even more dangerous. Desire. I ran my hands through my hair, still damp from a restless shower that had failed to cleanse the guilt clinging to me. I kept telling myself we hadn't crossed the line, that we stopped before it became irreversibly blurred. But deep down, I knew the truth. Lines aren't just crossed through actions. They're crossed in thoughts, in emotions, in the forbidden things we allow ourselves to imagine when no one is looking. And last night, every silent boundary had been obliterated. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made my heart lurch. I straightened instinctively, smoothing the hem of my shirt as though it could somehow erase the evidence of what had transpired. The door creaked open, and there he stood. Anthony. "Morning," he greeted, his voice soft yet steady. "Morning," I answered, my tone slightly too high, too rushed. I averted my eyes, unable to meet his. For a moment neither of us moved, the silence between us dense, weighted with unspoken words. At last, he stepped further into the room, closing the door behind him with a quiet click. "Sarah," he began, his voice cautious as though unsure how to proceed. "We need to talk." "I know," I said hurriedly, my hands clutching the edge of the bed. "But I don't know what there is to say." "There's plenty to say," he responded, his tone firm but gentle. He moved closer, step by step, until he stood directly in front of me. "Last night, it can't happen again." I nodded, the words cutting through me like a blade. "I know, but knowing doesn't make it any easier," he continued, his expression softening. "It doesn't change how I sense." My breath caught, and I looked up at him, my heart thundering in my chest, Anthony, we can't do this. It's wrong. It's too complex. Everything worth feeling is complicated, he murmured, his voice low, almost a whisper. Then, he reached out, his hand briefly brushing against mine. A touch so fleeting it could have been accidental, but it wasn't. I couldn't deny it anymore. This was real. I closed my eyes, his words cutting through me like a blade. He was right. It was real, in a way that both terrified and overwhelmed me. But being real didn't make it right, and it certainly didn't make it safe. I pulled my hand away, standing quickly and putting space between us. We can't keep doing this, I said, my voice shaking. If Stephen finds out— He won't, Anthony cut me off, his tone suddenly sharp. He's too caught up with work to notice anything going on here. It doesn't make it right, I snapped, frustration rising in my chest. You're his son. Stepson, he corrected, his voice strained. And I'm an adult. So are you. His words lingered in the air, making the room feel unbearably small. I turned away, my hands trembling as they gripped the back of the chair by the window. The sunlight now felt harsh, too glaring, too revealing. This isn't just about us, I finally said, my voice barely audible. It's about everything else. Stephen, this house, our lives. It's about what we want, he replied, his tone softening. And maybe it's about what we deserve. I turned to him then, my chest heavy with the weight of his words. His eyes looked at mine, and I saw the same turmoil reflected there. Guilt, longing, fear. He moved closer, and I stayed rooted in place. Sarah, he murmured, my name a breath that sent a shiver racing through me. Tell me you don't feel it. Tell me you don't want this. His lips were chasing enchantments, and his eyes were cloudy, tranced by events. He murmured my name again, and soon slept with me. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. I couldn't tell him that. I couldn't lie, not to him, and not to myself. His hand extended once more and cupped my cheek tenderly, causing my heart to throb. His thumb grazed my skin, and I instinctively leaned into his touch, yearning for the connection I had resisted for so long. Anthony, I murmured, my voice unsteady. His gaze locked with mine, and in that instant the world seemed to fade away. There was no Stephen, no house, no repercussions, only the two of us, teetering on the brink of something both perilous and unavoidable. I can't do this, I murmured, though my tone betrayed my hesitation. Yes, you can, he said softly. We both can. Kate, before I could say a word, the sound of a car door slamming outside broke the moment like shattered glass. My heart shot into my throat, and I pulled away from him, panic surging through me. It's Stephen, I said urgently, my voice trembling. Anthony stepped back, his expression a mixture of frustration and reluctant acceptance. We'll talk later, he said firmly. I nodded, my thoughts racing as I reached for the door, gripping the doorknob as if it were the only thing anchoring me to reality. The front door creaked open, and I heard Stephen's voice call out as he stepped inside. Hey, honey, he greeted cheerfully, completely unaware. For a moment, I stepped into the hallway, leaving the storm of emotions behind me. But even as I greeted him, my mind remained in that room with Anthony, tangled in the unresolved choices we had yet to face. The silent moments ahead felt like nothing more than the calm before the storm, and deep down, I knew this was just the start of a story, far from its conclusion. That's the end of today's video. Thank you so much for watching. If you found our content engaging, a thumbs up and sharing it with your loved ones would be much appreciated. Make sure to subscribe to our channel, Love 30K Stories, and turn on the notification bell for updates on our latest videos. Your support is everything to us. Until next time, take care and goodbye.